Hi, I'm Katie Crane, and this is the Pilates Lounge. Hi everyone, my name's Katie Crane. I'm the Pilates professional. Welcome to another episode of the Pilates Lounge podcast. Today, I have got a fellow Australian with me on the podcast, and we are talking all about a topic that many of us Pilates professionals have a little bit of a fetish with. We can get pretty down and dirty with this part of the body, and if you are not into this part of the body, I don't even know if you're a true Pilates professional. Andy Bryan is, of course, a podiatrist. He works with natural foot function. Now, I know that this is not an episode about me, but I've got a confession to make, Andy. I'm not a fan of podiatrists. In fact, quite often I have clients come to me telling me that the podiatrist told them that they've got to wear these shoes or that they've got to wear inserts. And I feel like there's so much misinformation out there. And so no pressure on you today. But when I found you, I felt like you were a ray of light for your profession, because you talk about natural foot function. Now, you know that as Pilates professionals, we love not to work with shoe wear on or footwear on. And I've got a few questions for you about this. But before we get started, I better just properly introduce you. Andy Bryan is from Melbourne, Australia, and he owns a podiatry clinic called Melbourne Natural Podiatry. He's a podiatrist with 25 years of experience. That's a lot of looking at people's feet. But the last 7 have been focused on natural foot function and how, if we work towards this, we can address many of the common foot complaints that our modern lives lead to. This, of course, starts with the environment our feet are in. Shoes and attached to a body, address footwear and how the body moves, and our feet start to play fair. I reckon that many of our listeners are going to love this conversation. Welcome to the program, Andy Bryan. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for that introduction. Where do I go from there?
Yeah, I know, right? Make it good. You've got to speak for everybody who works with feet now, right? But you
That's
hear
right.
me, don't you?
Oh, for sure. And I'm definitely still the black sheep of the podiatry family. There's a Facebook group of conventional podiatrists that I tune into and answer questions. If people ask me questions or ask questions about things that I would suggest that I might know more about, as in natural foot function, and I get derided and almost abused regularly there. So I dip my toe in that water very gently, but sometimes I get brave and then I get feel a bit sheepish again afterwards.
To be sure. Well, I mean, you know, you're living life on the edge, hey, pushing the boundaries of your profession.
That's right. Who would have thought? Yeah, who would have thought there would be a professional edge to a podiatrist? But anyway, yeah.
So tell us, Andy, I want to hand over the mic to you to let us know why did you choose podiatry to start with? But what I'm really interested in is, where did your fascination and your interest for natural foot function come from? And could you explain exactly what that means?
Well, I'm really glad I'm a podiatrist, because I think it gave me a big grounding in understanding the foot, especially anatomy and some function as well. But that was maybe 30 years ago I decided to be a podiatrist. And I think I'd sat in on a work experience trip on someone doing an ingrown toenail surgery, and that's what interested me. So nothing to do with foot function. I was an elite runner at the time and kept getting injured as well. And so I was wearing orthotics. Not that they fixed anything. I ended up quitting running and just keep wearing orthotics for like 20 years after that. And I was in a mainstream podiatry practice making my own orthotics, but always an under-prescriber because I had to make them myself, and that took 4 hours. And I think I'm probably inherently lazy and thought, well, does this person really need it? Or, you know, it wasn't in my plan to spend an extra 4 hours at work too often. Anyway, and so then though, I'd quit running and started cycling, and then I had 4 head injuries. And I do wonder whether this all came about because of some madness. I had 4 serious concussions and had to quit cycling. And for some reason, I still don't know why, I went to a yoga class just at a local studio. and just happened upon good teachers that were cueing good ways to use your feet that I now know in retrospect, and noticed my own feet getting stronger and thought I'm doing all the, and noticed how my feet started, how our feet were so intertwined with the way the rest of our body should move. And so then I thought, why shouldn't I be helping my clients strengthen their feet as well? Why should I be relying on orthotics or getting them to rely on orthotics? And that was the hard thing. I was still in this practice where they were still very mainstream podiatry. So I ended up leaving that practice and just starting on my own. And so I just work on my own now with my wife doing my admin shared with me. So that's been the progression as a podiatrist. And it was really yoga that started it. I also went to the gym for the first time and started seeing other people train barefoot and started thinking about getting back to running without my orthotics and trying to run in less shoe. And my first run in less shoe was like in an Adidas casual trainer, and my calves just burnt up. Like they were just dead within a kilometre because of how flat they are and how unsupportive they are, and it just made my calves do some work. We're very lucky here. We have a barefoot shoe store here in Melbourne, and I bought some of those, and it just all sort of progressed. And then I started preaching that to my clients, and here I am now. That's not all I do. I still do mainstream podiatry, as in cutting some old ladies' toenails that can't reach anymore. But even that I'm phasing out of because it's not really my true calling, and I don't think it's the best use of my time. And so now I see people that want to change into more, get their feet rehabilitated, or have seen like 5 other podiatrists and physios and all these different professionals and haven't thought about rehabilitating their feet as opposed to supporting and using structure on their feet. And so that's most of my clients now, that type of person that's had some bad experiences in the past. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So that's how I've come to where I'm at. Yeah.
And so natural foot function, I mean, if I think of natural foot function, then personally, I'm thinking of, either using like the barefoot shoes or going barefoot, walking in the dirt, in the sand, on rocks, doing things to strengthen your foundation. So, rather than relying on, like you say, like orthotics or the leather coffins.
Yeah, the supportive shoes. So I think if we look at natural foot function, like at uni, we're taught this perfect way for the foot to function. We land and then we pronate and then we get to mid stance and then we start supinating and push off. And there's these ideals. And then I think we're taught that is the way everyone should function. But in reality, everyone has slightly different biomechanics. As long as those main things are happening, then that's what natural foot function is. But I think we've been taught to practice in a way to try and make everyone this perfect model of the way the foot should function. And I think if we get out of the way of our modern lives, so it's footwear and a lot of sitting, mostly, like inactive lives, then our feet are just doing what natural foot function is. Like if children are just being barefoot or in a shoe that is just protecting them from sharp things, hot and cold, but not supportive, not cushioned, and not squishy, and they're moving their bodies in many and various ways, as children do because they play, then that's what promotes natural foot function. And if we had a community of kids doing that and they grew into adults, their foot function may look different from one to the other, but that would be that person's natural foot function. And they would be doing generally the same thing of landing, pronating, supinating, pushing off, and being a healthy human. So I don't think there's this perfect way of doing it, but I think there are some fundamentals that we need to look for and not try and perfect it too much. Yeah.
Right.
So that's what I mean when I talk about natural foot function.
Okay. And so shoes or no shoes?
So shoes. So nearly every shoe that we wear in conventional cultural, our society, has got a heel. So this is changing our posture. It's changing when our foot hits the ground. They're nearly all stiff from heel to forefoot. And so that means all those midfoot joints and the muscles that cross them aren't having to do as much work or taking as much load. They're almost all cushioned or removing us from feeling the ground. I would say this is almost the biggest one, but the hardest to help people change with, because that means they're not feeling the ground or having their body understand their environment. I'll talk about that a bit more late in a second, because the last one is probably the most important. That's that the toes are squished. And so most conventional shoes are widest at the base of the toes, and our feet should be widest at the tips of the toes, like children's feet are, and people that don't wear shoes have feet that are widest at the tips of the toes, so that our toes can both extend and compress. They're not meant to just be extended the whole time. They're meant to be able to move. And most of the muscles of the foot are attached to our toes, and so it would make sense that our toes are meant to be able to move. But if we go back to that cushioning or something that takes us away from feeling the ground in terms of modern shoes, if you can imagine walking on a beach and you can smell the salt air, you can see that you're on a beach, you can hear the waves, every sense in your body is telling you that you're on a beach, and then you're wearing a pair of shoes that don't fit that picture, and your nervous system, particularly the plantar surface of your skin, of your foot, which is the skin, which has hundreds of thousands of nerve endings, are missing the picture. And so your brain is constantly confused. And that's obviously there's a lot of input coming into you when you're walking on a beach. But even if you're just walking through a city or up and down the street, you're getting all this input, and your feet the message from your feet is not matching what the rest of your body's feeling. And I think we could put that down to, that could be an issue for a lot of, complaints that we have throughout our body, because our nervous system is constantly going, okay, what is the hell's going on? Because the picture is not full because our feet aren't feeling things. And so natural foot function should definitely not have a conventional shoe on. I don't think the two could mutually exist. It should be a shoe that is wide at the tips of the toes, flat from heel to toe, flexible so our foot can move, and thin so that your foot can feel the ground. Not sharp things, not hot or cold, but feel the ground. So yeah, natural foot function doesn't involve conventional shoes.
Do you, when you work with people, this is my perception, so I'd love to hear what you see in people. So like you say, when, so our feet, proprioception, taking information from our surroundings all the time, informing our brain whether or not we're safe, what the surface is, all of these things, right? Our nervous system responds to that information. Would you say that people that work towards natural foot function using shoes that do give more feedback, or, people who walk around barefoot, are their nervous systems more regulated? Just a quick little interruption to say a big thank you to listening to the Pilates Lounge podcast. This podcast is all about sharing our love of movement and Pilates with as many people as possible. So if you're enjoying the show, please take a moment to review us so that we can get the word out there. Also, if you haven't joined us on the Pilates Muse newsletter, it's a bi-weekly newsletter that shares a whole load of information with you. And we also have virtual online education programs. So if you're looking to get inspired and grow even more as a Pilates professional, check us out, www.thepilatesprofessional.com.au. Back to the show.
I would suggest it happens almost immediately. Mm-hmm. Ask anyone to go barefoot on the beach and they immediately feel a sense of calm, mm-hmm. or, possibly, there's this idea of grounding as well. Or if you go for a walk on some nice cool grass on a hot day, this is an immediate desensitizing of you. Oh, well, maybe heightened sensitivity of your nervous system, but, a grounding sensation. So I think it happens almost immediately from when you take your shoes off. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, there are people that just wear shoes all the time. Like they get out of bed and put their shoes on and then walk to the shower, have a shower and get out of the shower, put their shoes on, and they're in shoes all the time. And this can sometimes be a bit cultural, like some cultures are that way inclined. But other time it's because the podiatrist said you must wear your orthotics and your big shoes all the time. Or it could be out of fear of movement, So often, though, those people are the biggest converts. Like if you start changing things, they see big, rapid changes because their nervous system is just dying to feel something. You don't have to change much when there's so much limitation to start with.
Yeah. I think so too. I was actually out yesterday. We've got this, there was a boat here yesterday called the Americano Vespucci or something like that. It's like an Italian naval boat, and Darwin was the only port that it came to on its world trip. So we went down there and went on, and you had to wear shoes on board. I literally walked up there with my shoes in my hand, put them on, and went on board. I hate wearing shoes, and I've had these shoes for about 3 years. My husband's like, They look brand new still. I know I never wear shoes. I can't stand having my feet wrapped up in anything, but a lot of people do.
Yeah, it's interesting because that would have been for safety, for health and safety, that they would have made you wear shoes. I have some carpenters and tradesmen that are meant to be wearing a steel cap boot, but they wear their hiking, their barefoot style hiking boots instead, when the officials are off the site. And they say they're far less likely to hurt their feet because they're so much more conscious of the way they're using their feet rather than just having this brick on the end of their leg.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that makes me think of is at the gym. When you go to a gym, sometimes there's a you must wear shoes policy because they're worried about a weight dropping on the foot. But I think that's quite funny because I don't think there's many conventional shoes or, unless you're wearing a steel cap shoe that's going to save your foot much if you drop a weight on it. Mm-hmm. And I think you're more likely to be super conscious of dropping a weight on your foot if you don't have shoes on. So, yeah, I think that there's a bit of an issue there with that health and safety idea. It's just, we're far more conscious of our feet as soon as we take our shoes off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. Could we talk arches, like when we look around at feet, there's definitely very different, like the shape of feet, the way that the arch is, the width of the feet. It seems like it's definitely different in different races, right? So when I work with an Asian person, they often have quite wide, flat feet. Our Indigenous Australians, very wide, flat feet. When I work with my wound up English people, they have very high arches and very narrow foot, So why is that, do you think?
So I think, firstly, arch height has a very low correlation with injury. So, we used to have this idea that having a low arch or a flat, and people call it a flat foot, but flat foot is extraordinarily rare. That's a foot that doesn't move from that position. So I would rather call it a low arch profile because even people with what they perceive as flat feet often just have a lower arch. And then that's also just a static moment in time. It's not looking at the arch functioning. So it's just when they're standing, they've got a low arch, standing still. And then someone might have a higher arch and it doesn't actually have much correlation with injury. Someone with a lower arch might be more likely to get a certain type of injury, and another person with a higher arch might be more likely to get a different type of injury, but they're not more likely to get injured because they've got that certain type of arch.
Mm-hmm.
And so I like the analogy of some people's noses. They might have a big nose or a small nose, but they can mostly all breathe through their nose and smell through their nose. And so arch height doesn't really matter. It's more about how well it moves. Mm-hmm. And so we want to see that the arch can compress and then come back up again. And so when we're talking about arches, I talk about high arch profile, low arch profile, medium arch profile, no normal, because normal would suggest that there's a ideal. And these ideas of ideals come from, our military background of standing up straight and have a really good posture and making sure your arch is up, and that you couldn't have flat feet in the army because you'd run and you'd get injured. Well, that's just a bit of a furphy, really. And so we're all meant to have arches, Well, children don't really have arches until they're 6 or 8 years of age. Their arch might start to form, mostly because when we've got this big fatty pad when we're 2 or 3 and the foot's hardly formed, it's giving us the biggest base of gait and support possible for our big head as a child, and then the joints and bones are so loose and flexible that arch is meant to be flat until 6 or 8. In fact, having an arch at a younger age is possible sign of something else going on, like a hypermuscular tone. And so we want this flexibility. And so to support it is stopping the muscles that are going to support it from having to do their job. And then you're leading to a foot that's going to be less functional compared to what it was meant to be anyway in children. So, we see so many parents or grandparents or shoe shop people saying, oh, your kid's got low arch or flat feet. They say flat feet, you need to have support. It's like the opposite is true. There's nothing to be gained from giving that child support, and then arch support, because it's not meant to be there. And then as we go further along, as we age, because it's a good way of looking at it, yes, some cultures have lower arch profiles because maybe they're less developed. If we looked at Asian cultures, they may have been less developed and had less stiff shoes over time. And so their feet haven't stiffened, but they also have more ground living. So they're more likely to have mobile and strong hips that control the arch. They just have generally looser joints, Asian cultures.
Mm-hmm.
They're more likely to need power. If you look at, not power, more likely to need speed to chase something down. It's they come from hot climates. So this is very generally speaking, hot climates. So they need to be able to be very fast at chasing prey. So a lower arch is more efficient at doing that. If you look at our elite sprinters, they are African Americans with low arched feet compared to our power lifters that are more likely to be building something heavy or pushing something heavy, from European background. And so, these are just, I get not cultural, racial changes that have happened with time. And then the other part of it is this idea that that if you, we gave up an opposing thumb to stand up straight. And so therefore it was seen anyone that had the flexibility and a wider foot was seen as a bit antiquated or less developed as a human, which is just crazy to think of, because it means you are more likely, more ape-like, because who we develop from, depending on whether you think we're evolved, or I always put that in because everyone has different ideas, evolved or designed. So to stand up straight meant that we could be a dominant species rather than having an opposing thumb and climb trees. It means we could travel a long way. And so it's still thought, maybe 100 years ago, that to have wide lower arch feet was a bit antiquated in terms of our evolution. And this is where these ideas come from. But we're still in it today. I have a podiatry student that I inspired. She's 48. She went back to school 3 years ago to get into podiatry. And she's telling me what she's learning in podiatry school first year at the moment. And they're still teaching that we should have this certain arch and that we should control pronation, all these types of things. So yes, that was a long-winded answer, but hopefully that covers arches. The shape doesn't matter as long as they can change shape. Movement matters more than static position.
Right. Yeah, I always wondered, culturally, is it because of the climate that people come from? So when you go to Southeast Asia, they're warmer climates. They're so much better at sitting low on the ground.
Yep.
Indigenous Australians, they sit cross-legged on the ground, whereas people from colder climates, higher arches probably weren't doing that as much either.
Yeah, so they're not getting the hips involved. They'll probably have to be more clothed, so that then clothing develops quicker, and so then stiffer shoes develop quicker. This type of thing. Yeah. There's so many. I've read into it as well, that how we moved through the world, and then how that affects our body shape and all that type of stuff. But there's so many different factors. Generally, if I'm having to explain it to a client, why. Well, I work in an area here in Melbourne that has a lot of Asian people, but mostly I don't see people from this area. They come from all over. But if I have a local come in and they're complaining and they're worried about their flat feet or their low arches, it's mostly because of mobility. They have more mobility. And whether that's because they are barefoot at home habitually, you go past a house where I live in an area where there's a lot of Chinese people. They've all got piles of shoes out the front door because they all go barefoot inside. Mm-hmm. And then, if we go to their homes years ago, generations ago, they were sitting on the floor a lot more than they are now, and a lot more than we have for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting.
Even still, at the toilets in those places, you have to squat, which is what we should be doing to go to the toilet. That's the position, the resting position or the toileting position. Yeah.
So what is the function of the arch then? So I would think of it as a shock absorber, when we're, walking and stuff, and it's the foundation of our support, but it also does it, I always think of the arch as being, if I look at the body, this is just, again, a lot of this is just my perception of looking at the body for a long time. First you have the arch, and then above the arch we have the pelvic floor. Above the pelvic floor we have the diaphragm. Above the diaphragm we have the roof of the mouth. So they're all, I think of them as all kind of working together cohesively, both to shock absorb, but also to kind of feed that rebound of our, of what walking is through the body. Is that kind of how?
Yeah, definitely. We have three arches of the foot. There's the medial arch, the one that you're talking about probably. There's the longitudinal lateral arch, so it's on the other side of the foot. And then we have the transverse arch, which runs from the base of the big toe to the base of the fifth toe, and then all the way back up into the tarsals, up closer to the ankle. And so they're all meant to help with shock absorption. So that's the lowering of those arches. And then, and so if you imagine the intrinsic foot muscles, these are the little muscles that start and finish within the foot. They're spreading and absorbing shock. We know that people with strong intrinsic muscles are less likely to get stress fractures of their feet because when they're strong, they're supporting those long, thin bones in the foot. And then as we load the forefoot, there's this something called the tie bar mechanism, which is this piece of fascia, I would suggest, across the metatarsal heads that spreads and then springs back. And in that springing back, it triggers these intrinsic muscles to start contracting. Similarly, when we start using our big toe, the base of the big toe joint, as we go to push off, as our heel lifts in gait, these intrinsic muscles start contracting and change the shape of our foot from one that is softening to one that is, I used to use the word stiffening, but it's just changing shape. It's still mobile, but it's just changing into a shape that is more conducive to pushing off, to transmitting power from the rest of our body through the foot into the ground so that we can be efficient at pushing off. And so these arches are designed to do that, to accept energy when we land and then release energy as we push off. Does that answer that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's how I see it. And I love that you then talk about the pelvis, the rib cage, up into the roof of our mouth. It's not a coincidence. This is the way we're meant to move in unison. And to think that our feet are just tacked on and they're the only bit that needs support, or supporting them is going to help everything else up the chain. Mm-hmm. You know, like it's actually, I think we'll look back at this time and think, wow, that was the dark ages of human movement, that for those 100 years, we were so worried about supporting the foot, you know, like I think we're really moving away from that now. We even see it in the running shoes. They used to all have medial support. Now they still they're even more supportive in a different way. They're super cushioned and stiff they're cushioned for landing and stiff to help you push off. Oh, funny that. Isn't that what the foot's meant to do? But before, you know, we've just come out of this 40 years of having these big, dense structures on the inside of our running shoes to stop us pronating. Oh, they've worked out that we're actually meant to pronate. This is a normal human movement. And so it is progressing, but it's at snail's pace, which is fine. You know, like we've got to get people used to these ideas.
Now, a while ago, you said that the arch of the foot, it starts to develop around about 6 years of age. Is that because of our relationship with gravity?
Yeah, I think it probably starts developing as soon as we start weight bearing, or maybe even in utero. But it starts being seen to develop around 6 to 8, and probably because our muscles and bones are getting some more substance to them. You know, they're starting to ossify more, and the joints are becoming more stable. Whereas before they were, you know, like a bag of bones. You know, and so I think that's part of it for sure. And you know, if you liken that to what the child is doing through those ages, it's very much play-based. Well, it's play. We should be playing our whole lives, but it's very ground play. And, you know, the foot is doing the most it probably ever does in those first 6 years, and it needs to be mobile and adaptive. And it's just getting all this feedback, you know. And so but then as we start to get stronger, it needs to get stronger so it can facilitate more efficient movement over longer distances, you know, as we move away from our parents and our home, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And then, so I guess, you know, just because, you know, depending on what your lifestyle is like, you know, then as with everything, you know, 26 we're at our peak and then it's a downhill slide, especially for us women. But, you know, like we tend to see people with a lot of foot issues, you know, like around about 50s, 55, 60, like we see a lot of issues in the feet. How do we start to change the thinking of people who are so fearful of taking their shoes off and strengthening their feet? What are some things?
Yeah, I think it's never too late. Like I have 80-year-olds that change into less footwear, a shoe that lets them use their big toe for the first time in 70 probably years, maybe 75 years, and then their foot responds. So I don't think it's ever too late. It just takes longer the older we get, or the less. Well, some people are still very quick to change, especially if they have active and lifestyles that encourage mobility and strength throughout, then their body's ready to adapt to changes. So I think that's the first thing to say. It's never too late. And then you just have to pick your mark in terms of where they're at and to move them. And some people, most people don't want to go barefoot all the time like you love doing. Like I come to work barefoot as well. But most people don't want to do that, and that's okay. Like it's more about just moving them down that spectrum. So if you've got clients coming in and they're wearing Hokas, those biggest cushion stiff shoes you've ever seen, and an orthotic, because this is often the case, they're in a Hoka and an orthotic. There's two functional, those two things shouldn't actually coexist, because one's trying to encourage this ideal foot function, the orthotic, and the other one is just wiping your foot off. It's like a moon boot. So to put them together just shows that the person that encouraged that has no idea what they're just totally focused on pain rather than function. Because sure, your foot won't hurt, but it also won't function. So anyway, if someone's coming in with that setup, just getting them to go without their orthotic might be a big step. And then getting them to a shoe that's still cushioned but wide, but with some flexibility, might be the next step, and they might end up in that shoe. There's a really good brand called Altra, A-L-T-R-A, and I put more people in that shoe than I do in barefoot shoes, because it's too much of a leap for most people to go without cushioning, even though I think it's a critical thing to actually be able to feel the ground. And so, if you move someone from Hokas and orthotics into an Ultra shoe that's got a bit of flexibility and wide toe box and is zero drop from heel to toe, so no heel, like you have increased their natural foot function hugely by moving them from that to that. And so it's about picking your mark and doing it very gradually. And then in the Pilates setting, you've got so many great tools to help strengthen, mobilize and strengthen the foot, calf, hip, core, to help facilitate those changes. Like it's like a match made in heaven, basically, really. If you want to get someone in less shoe, they should be doing some form of foot, hip, core work to facilitate that change. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, what might be, obvious to you and me, but for some of our listeners, what is the relationship of foot health to knee and hip health?
Yeah. So that's a good question. We'll start with knee. The knee is like a hinge. And so some might call it the dumb joint, in between a joint above it, the hip that's got multi-range, and the ankle and foot that has got multi-range as well. And so less about what we change at the knee, but more about what we change at the hip and the foot. Footwear-wise, if we're wearing a heel, well, if we're standing flat, and this is, if you can all picture this, if you're standing flat without a heel, your head is above your ankles. As soon as you put a heel on, so I'm going up on my tippy toes, you can just do that. Your head is still above your ankles. For that to still occur, your knees now have to be in a quad dominant position, a flexed position, and your hips are now tipped forward, and you now have more lumbar lordosis. These aren't inherently wrong, but if you're living in those positions, those positions, there's nothing wrong with them. But if you live in those positions because you're in a shoe that's heeled, then that's going to put more load on your knee in a way that's not really designed to have. More load on your lower back in a way it's not designed to have. More load on your hips in a way. And so that's, if we put a heel in our shoe, that's how a shoe and our feet can be affecting our knee and our hips and our lower back. If we look at the big toe, it's meant to work as a hinge joint as well, with a bit of variation. Like if we're pushing off and going sideways, it'll be able to twist and turn. But generally speaking, it works as a hinge joint. If you think of that base of the big toe as a hinge and put your finger out in front of it and see if your big toe is straight, I would say that 95% of people have a big toe that's sideways because their shoe pushes it sideways over time. And so therefore we can't engage the use of that big toe to push off. When we do push off through a straight big toe, we engage the inner line of our foot, or all the foot muscles, up through our inner calf, up through our adductors into our pelvic floor when we use our big toe. And so if we can't use our big toe because our big toes push sideways, we're missing out on this efficiency of movement. Our big toe has 6 of its own muscles. It has 2 extra bones, the sesamoids, designed to take load. And nearly everyone, if you look at your shoe wear, they're using the 2nd, 3rd and 4th toes to push off from rather than their big toe, because their big toe is being pushed sideways by the shoe. So we're missing out on that connection between our big toe and our leg and our pelvic floor all the way through our body because we're not pushing off. And so if the question is, how do our feet affect these other parts of our body? Like for me, that's it in a nutshell. I miss one bit. As we push off through our big toe, it gives us an ability to get into hip extension, and hip extension lets us out. That's our glutes. That's using our glutes. Like we're all talking about lazy glutes, glutes that don't work and all this type of stuff. Well, they obviously work. Otherwise we'd be just falling around on the ground, but they're not engaging as strongly as they could unless we're using our big toe to push off with every step when we walk. And so that's critical as well. But then the reverse is true as well. Like if we're sitting all day and have hips that can't internally and externally rotate, then our feet are going to struggle to pronate and supinate effectively because that happens with the power of the big muscles from the core and the hips that create control of pronation and power as we supinate and push off. So we need hips that are mobile and strong, not hips that can only work in one plane through forward and back. They need to be able to externally and internally rotate with control. And so hips and feet talk to each other and are as important for each other.
Right.
And the knee's the dumb joint in between. That's a simple way of explaining it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So if you're working with somebody who has, like that, like you see a lot of people like their whole toes real squished together, what are some things that you do? I mean, I'm getting, sometimes I get the TheraBand around the big toe, you got to pull it out and then use the muscle to pull it back, that kind of thing. What else are you doing?
Yes, definitely. And that's an interesting one that you just mentioned because there's 3 intrinsic muscles attaching into that big toe joint. One's pulling it away from the other toes, one's pulling it towards the other toes, but they're both pulling it down along with one that sits underneath it that pulls it down. So we really want to make sure we're strengthening the one that pulls it out and down. That's the important function. We don't want to strengthen the one that pulls it back towards the other toes because if it pulls it, that's not conducive to toe splay. So it's hard to do with bands because you have to actually pull the big toe back towards the other toes to get the muscle on the inside of the foot, abductor hallucis it's called, to pull your big toe back. So I generally get them, like a lot of my work is around getting that big toe functioning again. It's about having a long, flat toe, a toe that flattens rather than curls at the tip. Because as soon as we see it curling at the tip or the tip of the toe going a bit white when we're asking them to push their toe down, it suggests that the long flexor is working rather than the short flexor. Because the long muscle attaches to the tip of the toe, the short one attaches to the bone in between the base of the big toe joint and the tip of the toe. So we want that to be a long, flat toe, and we want it to be pushing towards the inside of our foot. And that will really engage the muscle on the arch of the foot. And you can feel it and get them to feel it as well, because then they can know, they get this feedback loop. Oh, when I do that, it engages that. And this is super hard for most people that have worn shoes that are squishing their toes. So that's my basic exercise to get them to just push their big toe down long and flat. Some people can't even do that, but they can leave it down while they lift their other toes up.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they're thinking about lifting their other toes up, but their brain's going, well, you've asked me to leave the big toe down. How do I do that? Oh, I engage those intrinsic muscles. So that's even more simple thing to do. Just leave the big toe down and lift the other ones up, and you'll notice abductor hallucis fire. And you can just give it a little help with your finger, push it so that it straightens out the bunion shape, and that engages it even more. And so I get them doing a lot of that. And even in that, they're putting their big toe down, lifting their other ones up and splaying the other toes, which is engaging those intrinsic muscles. And then the reverse, leave the other ones down, lift the big toe up, and you'll see little creases across the top of the other ones. Ideally, sometimes they start clawing. That's the long flexor. We want the short flexors. They're the long, flat toes. So I would say long, flat toes 100 times a day as a cue. Long, flat toes, long, flat toes. So, against that reformer bar, you want long, flat toes, not clawing toes, if you're trying to work on the intrinsic muscles. If you want to work on extrinsics, that's when you do the clawing exercise, when you pick up towels and you pick up things and, but rarely are they the ones that need work. It's the intrinsics that have gone to sleep because of shoes that are so stiff that stops them moving and squishes their toes together. I might use toe spacers sometimes. There's various types to help spread them out and bring some awareness to them. But they're not like, they're not like the thing that's going to fix things. I think movement is more important than just like and shoes. Like you can wear your toe spacers for 3 hours a day, but if you go back into your squishy shoes, it's kind of counterproductive.
Mm-hmm. And so the benefits of walking, on natural surfaces, I mean, when you talk about that, I'm thinking, walking in soft sand, and then walking in wet sand and, walking, you know what I mean? Like just changing up the surface that you could be on. Do you prescribe that to people, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so sand walking, we were, I remember podiatry lecture on plantar fasciitis and, just check if someone's been walking in the sand, check if they've been climbing a ladder. Be careful about, and then the message is, be careful walking in the sand, be careful climbing a ladder. And it's like in retrospect, like we're just sitting there taking it as students, as they still are today. But in retrospect, you're like, shouldn't the human foot be able to be just fine walking in the sand? But unfortunately, because we're on so many hard, flat surfaces in shoes that make them even harder and flatter because the shoe's so stiff and stops us feeling anything, we go into sand, especially soft sand, and it's super hard work because our foot has to do some work. And so if someone has a foot injury, possibly the worst thing to do is to say go on really soft sand and go for a long walk. That's going to be like too much load. So you might say just go down near the sea, but not too close to the crocodiles where you are, and where the ground's harder, because then you're getting some variation, without the super softness. Or I would suggest they go in their minimalist shoes that let them feel the ground on a bushwalk, somewhere, or a hike where the ground is different every step. And people freak out at that because they're like, don't I need my hiking shoes that are super stiff and supporting my ankle? I'm like, well, actually every step is going to be different. So there's going to be different load through your foot with every step, and you're less likely to be injured. And this is exactly what your foot is designed for, to feel the ground and adapt differently with every step, compared to being in something that's stiff and cushioned that stops you feeling the ground and makes every step the same, I think on that, ankle support only comes about in hiking shoes because we stop the foot moving, which is the thing that's meant to be able to change shape because of the ground. And so if you stop the foot moving because your shoe's so stiff, your ankle is going to be the thing that rolls, so you have to support that. So if you support that as well, what happens next? Well, it's going to be your knee.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I used to work with.
It's crazy.
I used to work with the army barracks up here, and oh my gosh, like their lower limb problems, all from those horrible boots that they wear. I just be like, just get them off. Just get them off.
Yeah. Well, most of the testing most of the old research is on army recruits. And this is where that flat-footedness idea came from, because they would make them do too much too soon. They came from civilian life to running in a big, heavy boot, which we know the weight of the boot is a big factor. The weight of the pack is a big factor. The fact that they're being loaded for the first time is a big factor. And they were never letting their big toes be straight and actually use a natural human gait. And they were taking a whole bunch of people that weren't moving to moving excessively. No wonder they broke down in their feet, So, yeah.
Yeah. So, what we see a lot up here is like the clawing toes, because everybody's wearing their Havaianas.
Yes.
And your feet are sweating all the time. So you're trying to grab onto those things every time.
Yes.
So I think
so
we've got to use
so a shoe should, I talked about wide, thin, flat, flexible. That used to be WTF, wide, thin, flat, flexible.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a new version of that, which I think is better, and this speaks to that. It's got to be flat, it's got to be flexible, it's got to feel the ground. So it's the 5 Fs: flat, flexible, feels the ground, foot shaped, because everyone's got a different foot shape. So we shouldn't just say wide, because some people have narrow feet. So just foot shaped. And the last one speaks to your Havaiana question: fastened. F for fastened. We should have something on the back of our heel to stop us having to claw our foot as we lift our foot, and not everyone does, and some people have adapted very well to not needing to have that, and that's okay. And they have strong feet and functional feet, but most people have to claw a little bit, or they have to hike at the hip to keep the shoe on, which is not a natural human gait. And so Havaiana actually have a shoe now with a strap on the back.
Ah.
I don't know if you've seen it. Saltwater are a brand of shoes that aren't a barefoot shoe that my wife and daughter refuse to wear barefoot sandals. My wife actually calls them anti-sex sandals, which might be a bit too much information. But anyway, I still wear them. Anyway. She and my daughter, 17-year-old daughter, wear saltwater sandals. They almost pass as a barefoot shoe that looks a bit trendy. But there are a multitude of sandal brands that look like Havaiana. Like, they've got a strap through the big toe and then go across your toe, but they've got a strap on the back as well.
Okay.
There's a brand just across the water from you called Piop Fledge in Indonesia, and they're some of the best barefoot shoe sandals.
Oh, I'll check them out. I'm there next month.
Yeah.
All right. Awesome. What else have you got for us? But as we start to wrap up, what are some of the most important things that we should be considering, when it comes to, like, say if I've got a kid, and I want my child to, not have all these foot issues. I mean, like plantar fasciitis and, all the ankle sprains and everything that we see. What are some key things that we need to encouraging our people to do?
Yeah, to start with, there's no guarantee. Just because you'll start wearing barefoot shoes doesn't mean you're not going to get plantar fasciitis or roll your ankle. But if you're starting to strengthen your feet and work on your balance and your mobility, then they're things that we know that if you've got plantar fasciitis, you probably don't have good mobility and strength and balance. So if you start working on those things, you're less likely to get it. But it doesn't mean you're not going to get it. With kids, it's easy because they're already barefoot a lot or they haven't had years and years of conventional footwear. So I encourage most parents to get their kids immediately into barefoot shoes without a transition process. Just do it. And the biggest issue is that they look different to most of their friends. But, if you go to some schools, a lot of the kids are wearing them. And if it makes your kid more athletic, then mostly they won't get teased because they're the most athletic ones and they're wearing athletic shoes. My daughter used to wear her barefoot hiking boots. So it looks like a hiking boot to go for a run in. And she'd wear them to school sport when she was in year 8, year 9. And the teacher once pulled her out and said, you have to be wearing sporty shoes. And she goes, oh, these are fine. She's not wanting to, create waves. And the teacher didn't know that Lucy was using her feet in a more athletic way than anyone else there by running around in barefoot shoes, but they just looked like hiking shoes, So it doesn't need to look like the shoe that is fit for purpose. It just needs to be what the kid likes wearing. Mm-hmm. My son's another good example. He played basketball when he was little. He's 15 now. He's quit basketball, but he would run around in his Converse Cons because you know what? Before Jordan, everyone was wearing Converse Cons to play basketball in. They are almost a barefoot shoe. There's no cushioning. They're flat and flexible, but they're a bit squishy around the toe.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're seeing in the NBA professionals wearing barefoot shoes that have a little bit of cushioning. They're getting made specifically for them. So it's changing, Also, I often get asked this question, and this is relevant to your question. My kid wants to play basketball and he's in barefoot shoes the rest of the time. What should I get him to wear? So if you go to the local basketball arena or whatever it's called and watch 10-year-olds running around, they're all in their little heavy Nikes. And if you shut your eyes and listen to what happens when the ball goes from one end to the other, it's like a herd of elephants running up and down that hall. You take those children to the swimming pool later that day, the very same day, and you wave lollipops at one end of the pool and they have to run on the concrete from one end to the other. You will not hear a sound of their foot landing because when you run without shoes on or a shoe that mimics you being without shoes, you are lighter on your body and you're using your body as it's designed.
Mm-hmm.
When you put that big cushion on, that big heavy cushion on that kid's foot, they end up hitting the ground so heavily because their body wants feedback. And that's the only way I can get it from hitting the ground hard. And so you actually have more ground reaction forces in a cushioned, heavy shoe going through the whole body than if you're running barefoot or in a minimalist shoe. That's like proven research. More ground reaction forces going through your body. There's less in your foot in the cushioned shoe, but when they're kids, they're adjusted to that. They're already ready for that. So for kids, they need to go straight into being barefoot more often. For adults, it's about finding where someone's at. If they're already injured with their feet, then you need to go really carefully. and you might go to one of those cushion versions. But it's also about finding where they're at in terms of, are they barefoot at home? Like I had a lady in here today who's never barefoot at home. And so this is a big step for her to go into a barefoot shoe. But if someone says, yeah, I've been working from home, and COVID was great for this, people started working from home and they either became someone that wore their shoes at home or they just went barefoot at home. And those that went barefoot at home have transitioned into barefoot shoes so easily because especially here in Melbourne, for 2 years, they were practicing going barefoot habitually. And so it wasn't a big step to go to a barefoot shoe. So it's about finding where people are at, whether they're movers. Like if they just come to Pilates twice a week and do nothing else, then that's like a red flag for me. They need to do more. Like they need to be someone that walks the dog and goes to yoga and goes to gym and has an active lifestyle. That makes it very easy for them to make these changes. If there's someone that's desk bound, does exercise twice a week at the Pilates studio, and that's ticking the box, this is like a red flag. You need to encourage them to not only move their feet, but move the rest of their bodies more if they want to make these changes, or just make those changes very gradually.
Mm-hmm. And what about, say, so like wearing bare feet, can be great at home, but what about, if everyone's got like concrete at home or, like there is hard flat surface.
Yeah, for sure. Especially where you are, there's more likely people want to be barefoot and the surfaces are going to be harder because they don't want the mildew in the carpet and stuff like that. And so then it's true. We're not meant to be walking on hard, flat surfaces all the time. There's an argument to that we don't ever really walk in very uniform ways with every step. Like if you're moving around a kitchen, you're moving in every different way. So that's part of one side of the argument, but you still got to meet people where they're at. And if they can't tolerate those hard, flat surfaces, then you want a shoe. Maybe this is where those barefoot inspired sandals come in that have a little bit of cushion in them to meet something hard halfway. Or you engineer your environment. I love that saying. I do a lot of work with a group called the Foot Collective. And they've got this thing called the Soulmate, which is like it's a foam roller made of cork, and then you split it in half and it becomes 2 half rollers. And like I've been standing while we've been doing this podcast, and I've been using a spiky ball under my foot, mm-hmm. and I've been using a Soulmate. They call them Soulmate. And I'm just standing here like walking, like I'm in my office. So there's carpet, but then a concrete surface underneath. And then I'd probably get achy feet standing here for an hour chatting to you. So I'm just changing my environment by having something uneven under me. There's different mats you can buy off all different, online, Amazon, whatever, where you can, if you're going to be standing in an area for any period of time, you just change that by putting some mats, some stones there or something. A Pilates teacher here in Melbourne made me some rock mats where it's just like maybe 40 centimeters by 40 centimeters, and he stuck all these mats on there, and I stand on that in the morning. It's better than having a coffee. Mm-hmm. It's like, whoa, I'm awake, So I have these Soulmates, these little half domed cork in our bathrooms at home, and I took one away to play with in the lounge room, and my 15-year-old son said, Dad, can you put that back in there? I like standing on that when I'm doing my teeth. Mm-hmm. So for 2 minutes a day, twice a day, he's there getting some deep texture into his foot. So yeah, we could add cushioning, or we could change the surface by engineering our environment. And then you're becoming more human, I reckon. This is what a human's meant to do, feel things under their feet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. We sell a lot of, now they're called Makalu, but they used to be called Footwakers. I got from the States. That's where I originally found them. And it's like a dome with like little hedgehogs on it, and you stand on that. So
perfect.
Yeah. We use them a lot in the studio, but anybody who buys them, I'm always like, whether you're in the kitchen all the time or whether you like them in the bathroom. Somewhere you have them, and just play on them while you're doing whatever you're doing.
It just brings awareness to your foot. Mm-hmm. And then that can't be bad. Like then you're like, oh, I'm aware of how my foot's feeling today. Oh, I went for a run this morning. It's a bit tired this afternoon. Well, that's because I used it. And so, you're just getting in touch with your body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that as a message of, bringing awareness to your foot and feeling different surfaces so that then your foot is giving you that information of what's going on in your environment. That's really cool. Well, Andy Bryan, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your time on the Pilates Lounge podcast. Hey, if people want to check you out, where can they find you?
Mostly, you could look at my website, Mount Waverley Podiatry or Melbourne Natural Podiatry. It's the same thing. But that's a bit antiquated there. on Instagram is easiest. It's Andy Bryan _podiatrist. That's where all my current thinking gets downloaded on a regular basis. I post quite regularly. You'll get sick of seeing foot posts, but it will hopefully educate. What I try and do there is educate people about natural foot function so that they start questioning what the rhetoric has been from podiatry and society mostly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I love it. Keep
Andy Bryan podiatrist. Yeah.
Don't let them bully you. We need more people like you, Andy, to keep pushing the boundaries and, question the rhetoric that becomes the fear mongering. So thank you so much for the work that you do. I really appreciate it. My name's Katie Crane. I'm the Pilates professional. Thanks everyone for joining me. We'll see you next week.